So you might have heard a lot of people talking about Claude Code and how you can use it to build basically any type of app, but it's still fairly technical to actually get started using it, and it's difficult to even know what to prompt when you first start using Claude Code in a project. So today I want to take you through how I would set up a project in Claude Code. I'm going to guide you step by step through how you can use Claude Code to start building an app from scratch without getting overwhelmed and without having any coding knowledge. So by the end of this video, you'll be able to create your own app using Claude Code. If you don't know me, my name is Chris, and for the last 15 years I've been designing apps and advising startups on product and design. And with that said, let's get straight into Claude Code and start building.
Build great products. Build great products.
So we're going to be using Cursor to build our app with Claude Code today. So you are going to want to install Cursor before you get started with the steps in this video. You can just go to cursor.com, download Cursor and install it from there. And you don't even need to pay for a paid plan for Cursor, because you can do this all for free just with Claude Code in your terminal in Cursor. And I'm going to show you how to set up everything here so that you know exactly where to start and how to start building your project. The first thing I want to go over is my framework for building a project with Claude Code and how to actually get started using it. So there's a few things that you need to know, but essentially through this video I'm going to take you through the following steps. First, we're going to install Claude Code, then we're going to create a claude.md and project plan.md file in our project. Basically, claude.md is rules for Claude Code to work, so it kind of tells it what it needs to do and how it needs to behave in your project, and setting that up can actually make the difference in the quality of output of the code and the likelihood of success of your project as well. And then project plan.md is just a markdown file, which is just a text file that we're going to use to store all of our project plan that Claude Code is working between. And that will mean that as we kind of work across multiple sessions with Claude Code, it can go back and read that project plan file, and it will have an idea of exactly how far it is through the project plan, because we're going to maybe be creating like a very long project plan here for the app that we want to build. We might want to do that over multiple sessions, multiple days, or multiple weeks even, and so we need to give Claude some context of the actual plan that it has to build that app. We're going to then go into plan mode with Claude Code, and we're going to build out our plan so you can create a step-by-step plan with Claude to actually build your app. We're going to then add all of our API keys to our project, and your API keys are basically just how your app is going to function using different services. So that means like an API key for OpenAI will allow your app to actually send stuff to OpenAI and get stuff back from OpenAI, and the same with any other API key here as well. It just means that your app can send and receive data from other places. And then we're going to start your local environment once your app has started to be built, and that is basically a web address that you can navigate to that's only active on your local machine, so your desktop, your laptop, and that will allow you to use the app as you're building it and test it as you're going. And then we're going to test your database, authentication and payment setup, which are the three kind of key things that you need to get a production ready app built. And these are the most difficult things to do, so I like to always set up this stuff first to make sure everything is correctly basically like hooked up together, that it's all going to work. And then after we've got all of that stuff, we can then start building the features for our app in earnest. And I'm going to talk to you about thinking modes in Claude Code as well. If this seems like a lot, I promise you it's much more straightforward as we start going through it, and so please bear with me and stick with this as we kind of work through these steps. If you're familiar with Claude Code, it probably doesn't seem like very much, but for anyone getting started, this is a lot of information, so it's okay to like take it slow and just go through this step by step. Here's an outline of what your project is going to need, just to cover this off before we start quickly. So this is the terminology for your application that you're building basically. So for a web app, we're going to have these things that we need to know what they are and how to talk about them. So you're going to have a front end. This is the visual that you see on the screen, the stuff that you interact with. You have a back end, which is the way that your app functions. It's how all of the actual workings out behind the scenes happen. So like when you click a button, it does something behind the scenes, and then you see something back on the front end, and the front end and the back end talk to each other basically. Next, you have your database, and this is where any user information and app information is going to be stored so that your backend or your front end can access that information when it's doing things. And this is like a filing cabinet of all of the information related to your app that your app can access at any time. We're then going to have authentication, which is basically how your users would sign up and log into your app, so we basically know who they are and who is using the app. This also means we can store information from the database against a specific user. And then finally we have payments here, which are services to enable payments in our app, like Stripe is a very familiar one, and payments and authentication and database are all going to be connected to each other so that the front end and the back end can talk to them and get the right information at any given time. Now this seems very confusing, and you can actually start with boilerplate templates for this that do exist out there already that have this stuff kind of set up in a project, or you can create your own boilerplate using Claude Code or any coding agent. But for now, I'm going to show you how to get started building this project from scratch if you haven't even used Claude Code before. So to start off with, let's go to our browser, and you're going to basically need to install Claude Code here. So if you go to anthropic.com/Claude-code, this is the landing page for Claude Code, and if you scroll down here, you will basically find this instruction here, install Node.js 18, which you can basically just go to the website and download and install that if you don't have it already, and then copy this to your clipboard, this code here, which is npm install. npm is basically a package manager which manages all of the packages inside your app, because you're not going to need to install packages to actually allow your app to do certain things. You don't need to know how they work, but it is useful to know what that is, and basically this is just installing Claude Code in our app project. So let's open this project in Cursor, which is just a folder that we've created on our machine, wherever you want to store that. And we're going to get a blank project here now that we've opened the folder, because there's nothing in this folder. There's no code, there's no files or anything. And so to get started, we're going to install Claude Code. If you go to terminal and then new terminal in Cursor, that will open up a terminal here. And a terminal is basically just a text interface to interact with anything on your computer and to execute different commands. So you can navigate to folders, or you can do a bunch of stuff related to your project here. And what we're going to do is just paste in this npm install text that we've copied from their Anthropic Claude Code website, and you press enter and that will install Claude Code for you. Now I've already got Claude Code installed here, so that's not going to do anything for me. But once Claude Code is installed, all you have to do then to run it is you have to just type Claude, and that will run Claude Code in your project. It will say, do you trust files in this folder? You just set yes, and that is now running Claude Code here in my project. And we just have this text interface here that says, welcome to Claude Code, tips for getting started, ask Claude to create a new app or clone a repository. It's very basic instructions. I'm going to show you the steps that I would take now to actually set up my project. So if you go back to this map, what we're going to do next is we're going to create a claude.md and project plan.md file in this project. So if I right click on the left here and go new file, I'm going to call this claude.md, and I'm going to do it again and create a project plan.md, and that's going to create these two markdown files. So claude.md is the instructions for Claude, and all I'm going to add here basically is this one bullet point. So I'm just going to say, when you complete a task from the project plan, update the project plan.md file so that we can track progress, tick off any items that have been completed. And you can add more and more rules to this as you build out your project in Cursor, but for now we're just going to add this instruction to claude.md, and then we have this blank project plan.md file which is basically going to get updated by Claude Code as it works through our project. And so we've now completed that step there of creating claude.md and our project plan.md. We then are going to go into plan mode for our app. So you need to have an idea of what app you want to build here, obviously, and all you have to do is, if you're in this terminal view where Claude Code is, you just press shift and tab and that will change the mode. You can see it's cycling between the mode, and we want to go to plan mode. So we'll say plan mode on, and this is basically going to let Claude Code create a plan for our project for us, and we want to give it a good idea of what we're trying to build, what technology we're using, what we want the user experience to be, and how we want the app to function here. That's generally the setup that I like to do here when I'm writing a first prompt, is not to use a PRD or anything like that, because often that can be too complex, although Claude Code is better at understanding PRDs than most. So if you do want to start from a PRD, you can drop that straight into Claude Code here if you want to, but don't just drop the PRD in and get it to build it. Drop the PRD into plan mode and say, can you create a plan using this PRD and add it to project plan.md, and that's going to add it to your project plan here. So let's create our first prompt in plan mode for our app. Quick break in the episode to talk about my community for people who are building apps with AI and want to actually launch their app and get real customers. It's called the AI App Builders Academy. So if you're building an AI app with Bolt or Lovable or Cursor or any of these AI tools, and you actually want to make a profit and launch your app, then this is the community for you. Inside, you'll get access to a community of other builders, as well as my 30-day app course, helping you go from idea to app to a profitable launch in just 30 days. You'll also get access to weekly calls with live workshops and training, as well as all of my startup frameworks and resources, and 24/7 support from the community to help you answer any questions or problems you're having with building and launching your AI app. So if you're building an app with AI and you actually want to make a profit and launch your app, then head over to school.com/AI apps to find out more. I'll see you there. So the prompt that I'm going to use for plan mode here is basically this, if you can see it, is I want to build a web app using Next.js and React that allows users to create podcast episodes from their favorite news sources. So it's really useful when you're building with something like Claude Code. It's good to know the technology that you want to build with. It's good to know what you're building up front in as much detail as you can. Now, Claude Code will help you out in picking like a tech stack if you don't know what you want to build it with. It's going to know like what a default kind of web application tech stack is. And so if you just say, I want to create a web app that does XYZ, it's going to pull that together for you. But what you won't know is you won't know until it's built it, or at least until it's written out the plan, the technologies that it's going to be using. And you might want to pick and choose those more carefully depending on how you want the app to be, what you want to do with the app further down the line. So if you want to scale it to a lot of users, for example, or if you want to manage the database using a certain tool, if you have a preference for one tool over another, you might want to prompt it that way. I think the easiest stack to get started with when building web apps is basically to use Next.js and React, which is pretty standard now for web applications. For your front end, to use Node.js and TypeScript. For your back end, which again is pretty standard for web applications. And then for the other pieces, for your database, for authentication and for payments, to use either Supabase or Convex for your database. Supabase is one that people are very familiar with, and if you install the Supabase MCP in Cursor, you can actually get Cursor to update your Supabase database as you build. Convex is a database that's going to live inside your code base, and you can find out more information about that on the Convex website, but essentially you'll be able to manage your entire database from your code base inside your code, and so it kind of keeps everything like inside your project, and it's a really good Supabase alternative that's kind of building your database inside your code base. For authentication, to use either Clerk or Supabase. So if you're using Supabase for your database, it might make sense to also use Supabase for authentication, and to set that up for email and password and Google OAuth login and sign up, which you can do fairly straightforwardly. The Google sign up part can be a little bit tricky, which is sometimes why I like to use Clerk instead, because it kind of has that all like set up and configured out of the box, which makes it super easy to integrate. Although there are like a bunch of common errors that come up when integrating Clerk with AI, so you do always have to go through like a few fixes to get that. Again, that's why sometimes like a boilerplate can be helpful to start your project, but we're building it from scratch here, so we're going to keep going here. And then for payments, basically Stripe is the kind of default go-to, but I also really like Polar and would recommend Polar, which is polar.sh if you want to find out more information. And they basically act as a merchant of record, so they handle all the tax stuff for you from international payments, and they're also set up for AI-based usage in applications. So if you're building an app where you want to bill people based on their usage or the number of messages they're sending, then Polar is a really great option. Autumn is another option as well, which is a more recent company out of Y Combinator that's built on Stripe, but it also handles the AI usage-based pricing. We basically want to define all this in our first plan prompt for Claude Code. I want to give basically Claude Code an idea of the context of what type of app I want to build and who it's going to help and how it's going to help them. So it allows users to create podcast episodes from their favorite news sources. The user would be able to select news sources after they sign up and then have a 5-minute podcast summarizing that news created every day based on the latest information from the RSS feed for that website. Again, specifying the technology that I want to use here. I want to create a Node.js backend using Convex for my database, Clerk for authentication, and Polar for payments. So being clear about how you want to set that up and what tools you want to use is going to give Claude the best possible chance of like creating a plan that's going to work for your project. One of the most difficult things you can do when you're building apps with AI is to create an app, add loads of complex functionality, and then have to wire in your authentication and database and payments after you've built this really complex app. It is really difficult to do. And so I think the best way to do it when you're building an app in any tool is to set up this stuff up front. And then as your app builds the functionality, it's going to already have the system kind of in place to like store the right things against the users and to connect payments to users and to have all of that kind of stuff like already hooked up. It's like wiring a circuit behind the scenes so that when you plug anything into that circuit, it automatically works. And when you build functionality on top of that circuit that you've already hooked up, it already is going to know exactly where it needs to connect things, rather than like creating all of these wires everywhere and then having to rewire everything to fit a new setup. That's the way that I like to look at it anyway. I've got also said here, set up this project so that when a user signs up with Clerk, the user is added to the database and any payments in Polar are also connected to a user in the database. So we want to give a bit of definition around how we want the database and the authentication and the Polar and the payments to work. Generally, Claude Code or any agent will kind of know this already, but it's good to be specific. The pages I want to create are a landing page with a get started button, a Clerk sign up flow, a dashboard showing my podcast episodes and news sources, and an onboarding flow that asks me to select news sources and then generate my first podcast episode. I like to start a project with really simple. Now, this may not seem simple, but with like one piece of functionality, basically one key bit of functionality that I'm building here with only like 2 or 3 pages maximum in my app so that I can reduce the complexity so that Claude Code can focus on wiring up all the stuff behind the scenes and having the context of like a really basic app to build. So that we can test and we can use that to test basically if the database is working correctly, if users are being created in the database, if payments are being associated with users, if Clerk is working correctly, all of that sort of stuff. And then I'm going to also add in here any details about functionality that I want to build. So for the functionality, I want to use RSS feeds to get the latest article information, OpenAI to create the podcast scripts, and 11 Labs to generate the audio from the podcast script. Create a plan for this project and update the project plan.md file with this plan once I have approved. So that is also instructing at the end of this first prompt, I want to update project.plan.md with the plan once it's been approved. So let's send that to Claude Code. And Claude Code now is going to create a plan for this web app that we're building. So it's going to go and do some research. It's going to design the database schema, plan authentication with Clerk and Convex, create comprehensive project plan document, plan payment integration with Polar, design an RSS feed processing workflow, plan OpenAI and 11 Labs integration, and then design the front end page and user flows. So it's broken that down based on our really clear and specific instructions for the stack that we want to build the app in and the type of app that we want to build, which are going to give us the best possible chance of getting a really good output. So what we've got here is Claude Code has said, I can see this is here we go. Sorry, that jumped around. It says, this is a fresh starter directory. Let me design the comprehensive plan for your podcast generation web app. Project plan, AI powered news, podcast generator. Here's the tech stack that I've outlined here already. Again, if you don't include the tech stack here, it will include this for you, and you can kind of check from that how it's going to build it. It's got the database schema here, so it's outlined how the database is going to be set up, which again, like I'm not super familiar with some of this stuff, but I know roughly what I'm going to need here. So it seems like we've got a users table, news sources table, user news sources table, and podcast episodes table. That makes sense. We want to store like news sources against a user. That's the user news sources table. We also want to have a table for all of the available news sources that we have. And we also want to have a podcast episode table that will have the podcast episodes that would be associated with a particular user as well. And then it's going to break down basically core features and implementation. So here's the core features, these 5 features: authentication, payment, integration, RSS feed processing, podcast generation, front end pages. The app structure is here, and then implementation phase. It's going to basically outline 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 phases for us to go to actually build this app. And then once we are happy with this project, it's broken down the implementation phases into steps as well. So we can then just say yes or no. And if you say no and you click keep planning, you can give it more feedback on what you want to change in your project plan. So you might want to say like, actually I want to use Supabase instead. So let's say no, and I'm going to say I like the plan, but use Supabase instead. Or if it's giving you like a certain direction that you don't like, you can just say no and then change the direction of the plan before you actually add this to project plan.md. And once you're happy with it, you basically just say yes and auto accept edits, and then it will go and build this project for you. And that is starting to build your Claude Code web app project. So we've done plan mode. Now we're going to add API keys to your project. So Claude Code is now building our project for us, and you can see basically Claude Code is starting to work. What it's going to do is it's going to ask us if Claude Code is allowed to do certain things. You can say like yes or yes and don't ask again for certain commands. If it's going to happen a lot, you can do yes and don't ask again. Basically what most of these are is installing dependencies, initializing projects, all of your kind of terminal commands that would like get things running or like creating a server, that sort of stuff. For the most part, you can just say yes to these and it will be absolutely fine. And the only real command that we're going to need to know here is later when we want to start our local environment and get that up and running so that we can test our app. So let's just say yes to these. And once this is set up, I will show you exactly what it has done. So you can see now that Claude has finished setting up this project. On the left-hand side, I have my full project here with all of my files in and basically the foundation for this app that it's created. In the Claude Code window here, it says perfect, I've successfully set up the foundation for your AI powered podcast web app. Here's what I created: core setup and then key files created, and it's done this all based on my instructions in my initial planning prompt and the plan that it was following that Claude Code created for me. It's then given me next steps here, and it's also updated in the top here. You can see that it's updated this project plan.md file as we've put in the instructions here, and my instruction in the prompt. It's also updated the project plan.md file, and it's ticking each of these items off in the list as well as it goes. So what it's done, it's created the foundation, set up Convex, configure Clerk, create the basics project structure, set up environment variables, implemented Clerk webhook for user sync, create Convex mutations for user management, set up Polar webhook for payment processing, and it's given us clear next steps for what we need to do in our project in Claude Code down here. If we look, so it says next step, run npx convex dev to initialize your Convex deployment. So let's copy that, and this is going on to the next step here, which is add your API keys to your project and start your local environment. So if you go over to this env local file, what you'll see set up is all of your API keys. What we need to do here is go and get all of our different API keys from these different services and paste them in here so that our app will work, so that all of these APIs are going to work for us. That is going to be the API setup, is pasting those in there. That's step 2 here, set up accounts and get keys. So you basically go to all of these things and set up your accounts or create your apps. So if you're using Clerk, for example, on your Clerk dashboard, you create a new app, you get your Clerk secret key and your publishable key and your webhook secret from there, paste them back in here, and that will basically give this app all of the keys it needs to actually link Convex, Clerk and Polar together. If you're doing this with Supabase, you will set up your projects to work with Supabase, and you'll essentially need to put in like your Supabase project ID, I think, and a Supabase API key as well, so that this can like link to your Supabase database and authentication. But it will set it up and give you instructions in the same way that it's done here. So let's run npx convex dev, and how we do this is we basically just click this plus button here. This will open up a new terminal, and then you've got multiple terminals on the right hand side here, and so we're just going to paste that in there. We just do yes, it needs to install the following packages, so it's going to install Convex. We've got an error here already. Wonderful. Okay, so we're not running it from the root directory, which contains the Convex app, because we're running at this Claude Code starter level, and actually the root directory that contains Convex is this podcast news app folder. So what we need to do is do cd podcast news app, which will navigate us to the podcast news app folder in the terminal, and then we can paste the same command. This should work. So you can link this to a Convex account. So I'd recommend setting up a Convex account and then linking it to your Convex account. You can start without an account, so I'm just going to hit this to run it locally. And let's say this is called podcast news. And then it's basically going to run the Convex backend locally. I'm going to update it with the function you write, use, and then we're going to say yes here to set this up. And that is going to set up Convex for us in our project. So that's adding all the indexes for all of these tables in our database. Again, if you're using Supabase, this will be set up in a slightly different way, and you'll need to follow the instructions for Supabase in your project from Claude Code. So now we have done that step. Let's go back to our Claude Code terminal here, set up the accounts and API keys, and then fill in the environment variables in .env.local, which is what we looked at before. That's all of these API keys here. It's actually pre-filled our Convex information here because this is basically running locally. If you were signing in with your Convex account, it would update those details here. We are then going to configure webhooks in Clerk and Polar dashboards. So for example, if you're logged into Clerk here and you go to configure in your app project, you can go down here to webhooks and then add in webhooks here. So add an endpoint. It's going to add like an endpoint URL. This is basically going to be the way that your app communicates with Clerk via this. If you're not sure about this, what you can actually say, and this is the way that I like to use the cursor agent on the right hand side here, is just to ask it questions about this code base. So I'd say, how do I configure webhooks in Clerk, and what webhook URL should I be using for the endpoint? And then Cursor is going to be able to help you out here by reading your code base and then giving you an idea of how you actually solve this step. So it's reading your project here, for example. It can see everything in this code base, and it says based on URL, I can see you have Clerk webhook endpoint set up. Here's how to configure Clerk webhooks in Clerk, and your webpoint endpoint is located at this. So your webhook URL will look like this. Production. So basically, what we're going to do is we're going to set up an endpoint for Clerk that's based on our local environment that we're running our app in. And then that is going to allow us to test Clerk in a local environment. And then once we move it into production, we're going to want to change the webhook URL to the production URL for this. And it will give you steps to go through and set this up in your Clerk dashboard. And you can do the same for Polar as well. Now, this does seem like a lot more than setting up a project traditionally in like Lovable or any other AI tool. And that's because we're setting up all the complex stuff in our project ourselves using a coding agent. And so unlike Lovable, this is not going to automatically connect to Supabase or to Clerk or to any of these other services for us. We are going to have to set it all up manually, and it can seem like a little bit more work to kind of get this started when you're creating these projects. But once you have everything set up here, your foundation, this is going to make it so much easier to build your features on top of. Now we've done our webhooks in Clerk, you do the same thing for Polar here. So how do I configure webhooks in Polar, and what webhook URL should I be using for the endpoint? So we've got our chat history here as well, so we can go back at any time in Cursor to see previous chats that we've got. So I can go back and look at that one for Clerk, and I can go back and look at this one for Polar at any point in the future. It says I'll help you configure webhooks in Polar, identify the correct webhook URL. Based on your code, I can see you have Polar webhook endpoint set up. Here's how to configure it. The webhook endpoint is located at here, so your webhook URL will be, this is the one we need to create in Polar. And then here's how we do it. We go to Polar, log into our dashboard, go to organization projects, settings, webhooks, create the new webhook. And then based on your code, you need to subscribe to these events. So we're going to create those events, configure those events as well. Get the webhook secret. After creating the webhook, Polar will provide a signing secret. Copy this, add it to your environment variables as Polar webhook secret. So that's already added to our environment.local file here, which we can paste into there. And then, yeah, it said add the webhook secret to your .env.local file, that's the example there. Testing your webhook. For local testing, you need to expose your local server to the internet. And so there's a bunch of other steps that you need to go through here to actually test this working in a local environment as well before you actually deploy, which is one of the benefits of using a platform like Lovable or Leap or any of these AI code builders, is that you can kind of test this stuff live in preview on a temporary deployed version of your app, which is part of the reason why that can be so useful. But once you've got all of this stuff set up and working, you're ready to go. It is more technical, I will give you that. And the benefit of using something like Claude Code, because you might be thinking, well, why would I do this when I can use something like Lovable to set up my project easily and simply instead of creating something from scratch like this? If you want to create a fully custom application, which maybe has a different setup than this to a traditional web app, or you want to create more complex AI functionality in your app, starting a project like this is a really good way to get started. And although it seems complicated, Cursor and Claude Code as a combination are really good at giving you guided steps to complete all of this stuff and actually getting your project configured. So once we've done all of those, I'm going to go on to the last step here. So if we go back to our map, so we got start your local environment next. So that is basically this npm run dev command here. So let's open a new terminal and just do npm run dev. Again, we're going to have to navigate to this podcast news app folder, and then we'll do npm run dev, because that's where the application is working. And then it's going to give us a local environment that we can go to view this app, which is localhost 3000. If you open this web address, you can then see your app has been created here. So I have like my daily news powered by AI. I didn't give it any design direction. You can give it some design direction in your initial prompt as well if you want to add in the design. And none of this is going to work here. Clerk is in keyless mode. I haven't even put in my Clerk credentials here, but you can already see the flow kind of working. So you've got Clerk in development mode here. If I click sign in, that's going to work. It's not going to actually let me sign in because this isn't set up with any app in Clerk using any key. So if I click that and then go through here, let's continue. So that's not going to actually create a user in Clerk yet. You can see here it says you've created your first user. Now you need to link it to an application in Clerk. If I had created my application in Clerk already, this would have worked. You basically create an application in Clerk, give it the publishable key and all of the other information, and then that will allow you to test that. But all of this is now up and running and working. You've got your web app started here. You need to configure all of these details, and then you can get building your features on top of this, and you've got a fully custom web app built, your own code base, your own database, all of your stuff is owned. You own the entire code base. You're plugging in all of these services which are going to help you create your web app. So Clerk, Supabase, Convex, all of these other tools are industry standard and are used by hundreds and hundreds of web apps out there, and you've got a foundation here which you can basically build your custom app from in Claude Code. And so the last two steps here in the list is basically test your database, authentication and payment setup. So once you've got all of your keys added to this file, once you've set up the webhooks for Clerk and for Polar and got everything hooked up here, you would then go to your app in the local environment and go through and test all of that functionality. So test Clerk, test that users are being created in your Convex database or your Supabase database. Go into Supabase, check that the right tables have been created. If you're using Supabase, you might need to run some migrations or SQL commands in Supabase, but that is also fairly straightforward. And I can do another video on this showing you how to set up Supabase with Claude Code. If you want, just let me know if you want that. And as you test your database, authentication and payments, essentially what you're going to need to do is to debug these and get them working. So there will be probably errors and bugs that come up as you're building, and then after you've tested this and it's all working correctly, you can start building. And that's where we start doing the fun stuff. That's where we start adding features, adding new things on top of our app, using Claude Code to actually build stuff at pretty fast pace. Now that all of this initial, potentially more difficult stuff has already been set up and wired up for our app. And I wanted to cover off a couple of ways that you can use Claude Code whilst you're building that might help to actually build features better, and that is these thinking modes. So in Claude Code, you have a few different modes here. You have think hard, think harder, and ultra think, and you can basically just use these in your prompts to tell Claude Code how much compute and how much thinking you want it to do as it builds your features. So you would just say think hard or ultra think, for example, about a specific problem. And this can really help if you're building something more complex or trying to build a feature in just one prompt, for example, or you get to a bit where you're stuck in your project plan as you're working through your project plan. And always you can refer to this project plan as you're building your app to add a little bit more oomph behind Claude Code to get it to build something more accurate, basically, or to have a higher chance of actually building that feature. So that is my guide to getting started with Claude Code. If you have any other questions or you want to know anything else, please let me know in the comments below, and otherwise let's get into my final thoughts on building and getting started with Claude Code. So that was my guide to getting started with Claude Code. If you want to create a web app, and if you're a beginner and you don't know how to use plan mode or to set Claude Code up to actually build your project from scratch with all the required pieces from database to authentication to payments and a front end and a back end that is all going to work together and is industry standard so that you can scale your app to production levels, then hopefully you can see how powerful Claude Code is. Now it is a little bit more technical at some of the steps, But if you're using Claude Code and using it with Cursor, then the Cursor agent can really guide you through all of those steps that you need to do from Claude Code, and Claude Code is going to be the best AI coding agent at creating a plan for you and then building those features in your app, especially if you're building something that's more custom or more complex or uses complex AI functionality, or you need something really, really specific in your app. Now, you aren't going to get the same ease of use that you would get from something like Lovable or Bolt, which is just directly connected to Supabase, or from some of the other AI building tools where everything is kind of built in and it knows how to build all of that stuff without you even knowing how to hook it all up. But what it does give you is a huge amount of direct customizability and control over your entire code base, the exact same as you would get if you were developing it from scratch as a developer, because essentially you're using a coding tool and Claude Code is just writing the code for you in the coding tool, and you have direct access to everything in your project. One thing to remember is that when you do go from building in Claude Code to actually deploying this, you'll need to change everything so that it's set up for your production environment rather than your local environment. And so when you get to that point, it can be useful to duplicate your code base or have a separate branch in GitHub that's your production branch to your local branch where you're working on it locally, so that everything works locally, and then when you go to production, everything is working in your production environment as well. I know this seems like a lot of complicated stuff, but again, Cursor can guide you along the way. And if you are building an app and you do want to learn more about this, then I have a community to help people do exactly that over at school.com/AI apps. You can go over there to find out more. We have a community of over 100 people building web apps and helping each other and sharing progress. We have weekly calls and a course for you to learn exactly how you can build a web app from scratch, improve your idea, validate your idea, and then launch it and actually get real paying customers. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.
Build great products. Build great products.